This is Scott Spears, and today we are remembering a television icon, Sherman Hemsley, who has passed away at age 74. Sherman kept us entertained for years as George Jefferson on The Jeffersons, as well as many other movie and television roles. Also, we will discuss the censoring of a recent Jefferson's episode on TV Land during a Sherman Hemsley tribute. Joining us to help sort all this out is Emmy Award-winning actor, the star of Benson and many other productions, Robert Guillaume. Robert, how are you?
Okay, Scott, and you?
Doing pretty well. Robert, you worked with Sherman in Purlie years ago.
Mm-hmm.
How did you hear of his passing?
Well, as most other people did, it just got announced. I hadn't been in touch with him. I hadn't heard from him for years. We were not socially close.
I heard from a lot of people who had worked with him, but maybe not been so close with him, that it was kind of shocking. He was only 74 and no health problems that people knew of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, I was surprised by it myself. Seemed, although 74 isn't young, it seemed premature to me.
Yeah. How did you meet Robert Guillaume, or Sherman Hemsley, Bob?
I think I just met him as a result of working in Purlie with him.
Do you remember?
I don't think I'd known him prior to that.
Do you remember your first thoughts when you met him?
Well, I didn't have anything particular. I just wondered how he was going to do the role that he'd been charged with, which was Gitlow.
For people who don't remember, what was your role in Purlie, and what was that role about, and what was his role?
I was, if I can recollect properly or accurately, I think I played Purlie, he played Gitlow. I think they were brothers-in-law.
What was it like working with him?
It was very pleasant, very pleasant. I always found him remarkable in that role, just remarkable. His sense of timing and his authenticity with the comedy, I thought were extraordinary. He's a great, great performer.
When he had his success on The Jeffersons starting in 1975, and also a little bit before that on All in the Family, what did you think? This was the guy you had worked with.
Well, I was a little jealous, for one, that he'd been asked to come to Hollywood before I was, and then I wondered, well, what am I doing wrong?
When you saw him on the screen as George Jefferson, what did you think of that part?
I had mixed feelings about that part. I thought in Purlie, which was I thought a better use of his talents than how they were used in television in that first effort. I thought Purlie was a more natural terrain.
Now, why did you think it was more natural?
Because television had a way at that time of profiting on past stereotypes about black people.
What stereotype? Because a lot of people this week have portrayed or claimed that George Jefferson was the first upwardly mobile African-American man on television. So what stereotype do you believe he fell into that was an old stereotype?
That's a good question. It might be I might consider the old ideas, some of the old ideas about how black characters, in quite a few instances, just shut off their mouth without regard to the truth or without regard to authenticity. There were all kinds of stereotypical mistakes that the screen and television brought up. In that particular piece, I thought, well, let me say this. The character he played in Purlie, to me, was always more authentic. And that could be because it was written by R.C. Davis. And the character in Purlie was without, it was simply for the authentic fun of that character. Whereas I thought in George Jefferson, the character was outsized and socially irresponsible.
Do you believe the character grew? The Jeffersons was on for quite a while, 11 years. Mm-hmm. Do you think that character grew in the run from what he was in the beginning, kind of a loud mouth?
I'm not sure. I didn't look at it from that point of view. Perhaps if I had a chance to go back and look at it, I might well conclude that the character didn't grow or grew.
A lot of people have said this, Robert, that Sherman Hemsley was 180 degrees away from George Jefferson. He was quiet. He was kind of shy. Is that how he was off stage?
For the most part, yes. I found him to be that way. I think he had an idea of how to play the characters that he'd been offered. And he used a part of himself in a kind of outlandish way. And that's why I think that sometimes the character was criticized.
You know, it's very interesting that probably George Jefferson and then Benson, when you came along in 1977 on Soap, were really the first two, in different ways when you look at it now though, but the first two African-American men that were George Jefferson having money, Benson having brains. He was leading these people around. Neither one of those had ever been portrayed on television, and you both came from the same play. Kind of unique.
Yes, it was. Yeah. It was interesting in that regard, I guess, that you decide to examine the two characters. But I think that I'm maybe 10 years older than Sherman.
Yeah.
And a sort of it's a half generation of difference in what we found in terms of civil rights.
As I said, what difference would that be? That's interesting.
I think that when I was coming along, when I was 20, he was 10, of course. When I was 30, he was 20. And some of the things that we looked at, they were different. Things had been cleared up to some degree by the time he came along. They were more acute when I came along. There were lynchings by the, there were wholesale lynchings of black men by the time when I was 20. And when he came along, some of that had abated or been cleared up or been talked about.
Robert, I have in my notes here that, as I said, Sherman kind of hit the national spotlight in 74 with All in the Family and then the Jeffersons. You came about in 77 with Soap and then Benson. But in 1981, you and Sherman and some other cast members reunited for a movie version of Purlie. What was that like?
That was very nice. That was very nice. I always think it's nice to do, if you're going to do a film, it's nice to do one in which you had a lot of practice before you had to do it. And we certainly had enough opportunity to know the characters that we were going to portray on film.
Was there any difference in him from working the stage when you originally did Purlie and now with 6 or 7 years of national notoriety under his belt?
No, I didn't find any at all. That's the reason I always liked his work in Purlie, in that character. I thought it was hilarious. I thought he handled himself very professionally and authentic. His comedy was right on the money. It made you laugh, but it also made you think.
Do you remember the last time you saw or worked with him?
I think the last time I saw him or worked with him was probably when we were still doing Purlie together.
How will you remember him? If somebody says the name Sherman Hemsley, what will come to your mind?
Well, much in the same way we've talked. Now I remember him with great fondness, and I remember him as a stellar performer when I worked with him.
Absolutely, and gone too soon. Robert, before I let you go here, I want to talk a little bit about this because I think you would have an interesting perspective on this. In a recent TV Land tribute to Sherman Hemsley, they played, it was 4 or 6 episodes of the Jeffersons, but they played the original pilot. In the original pilot that aired in 1975 on CBS, the character of George Jefferson uses the N-word, and also Tom and Helen Willis have their interracial kiss, which was the first interracial kiss ever on television. When they reran this on TV Land in 2012, both of those things were taken out. The N-word was bleeped, and the interracial kiss was cut out of the episode. I want to start with the N-word, Robert. Do you think that it's okay to hear that on television in 2012?
I'm not absolutely sure. To say that I myself might use the word, but at the same time censor myself under certain circumstances is true.
If you got a script today that had that in there, you saying that word, would you do it?
It would depend on the context and the circumstance of the story. would depend on whether I thought it was an authentic use of the term at that time, and if in some way it advanced the story.
Why do you think, and this would just be an opinion, why do you think in 1975 on network television, when obviously language was a little more censored then certainly, this is just a few years after not even being able to say pregnant on television, that they allowed that word to get through on network television in 75, but on cable television in 2012, they have to bleep it?
Well, I think that in 1975, perhaps, they weren't as sensitive to the meaning of the word and the repercussions of how it might offend certain people, or people, period. There was less, in 1975, there was less objection to simply calling somebody whatever you wanted to call them under the idea of free speech.
In 1975, when Sherman said that in character as George Jefferson, when we see that today, do you think it takes away bleeping that word, takes away from the plot, takes away from the way in which he meant it, because he was playing a bigoted person, George Jefferson big. Does it take away from that, seeing that episode today, do you think, if you saw it and those words were taken out?
Scott, it's kind of rough water for me to be thinking in. I don't come down so directly on the side of protecting young ears from the use of the word. I don't come down so directly on, no, it should never be done. I'm sure that when we teach history, it would have to be acknowledged that at one time the term was considered less offensive.
I think the other censorship in this episode may be more peculiar, and you might even have more to say about this, because I believe there was a short-lived television series, the Robert Guillaume show, in which your character in that program was in an interracial, I can't remember if it was a marriage or a couple or...
No, they were just dating.
Dating, yeah. They took out television's first interracial kiss between Tom and Helen Willis. What do you make of that, Robert?
Well, that's more straightforward. It's the usual. Again, in matters of race here in this country, it's been difficult for people.
Is it more difficult in 2012 than 1975?
I don't think it should be. I think it should be abating by now. I think the sensitivity of white people toward interracial couples should be abating by now. And in the words of Joan Rivers, if one held on too tightly to old stereotypes about what can be said and what shouldn't be said, she'd often said, "Grow up!" And I think it's one of those things that it could be said in this instance. There was a time when, and we all know of a time when we were just afraid that if such and such took place, all hell would break loose and the heavens would rattle and we'd all be sent off into perdition. But by now, in any sophisticated society, we should know by now that the sky's not falling.
So in this instance, why do you think TV Land or the censors or the cable network, whoever took it out, why don't they know that, do you think? Why is it still a question?
Because it's difficult for people who, let us say, who are in standards and practices, for instance. It's difficult for them to go back and check themselves. They have certain standards that they think ought to be maintained. Sometimes, and I question the veracity of how they think. I question whether it is not simply a racial animus toward what they consider to be the mixing of the races. But I think that we have to understand that all of the light-skinned blacks that we have in the country didn't get here because of God. They got here because people have always trespassed, if you will. People have always... The world is full of all kinds of people because in the final analysis, nature doesn't give us what you think.
That's true.
Yes,
that's true. In the end here, Robert, because this is, to me, when I look at those two things, I can see the gray area on the N-word, where people would say, we just don't want to hear that. It's going to upset people. I can get that. On the interracial kiss, I don't understand why they took that out. And I guess my final question would be, does it make you mad that something like that would be taken out 30 years, almost 40 years, amazingly, after it happened?
Well, it would make me mad if we had a discussion about it, and I was up against people who were adamantly opposed to a more liberal idea about how things work.
Mm.
I don't know why they took it out. I think it's very childish.
I think a lot of people would agree with you. Robert, I can't thank you enough for joining me. As I always say, it's a pleasure. The opinions and the forthrightness and it's just all still there. And I always enjoy chatting with you and getting your opinions on all things going on.
Well, thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you so much. Robert, always good talking with you.
Nice talking to you, too.
Emmy Award winner, Robert Guillaume.